Again, can you just please confirm that you can see my screen
Yes, your screen is looking clean.
and it's nice and clean? Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we have people all across this great nation from coast to coast to coast. Yes? How exciting, how wonderful. So what I'd like to do is everybody can hear me well. I'm nice and clear. Yes? We're good?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So what I'm going to do right now is thank you very much, Ruben. It's an absolute honor to be part of this national conversation in regards to reconciliation. Um, when I go through the presentation, some of the slides, what my number one priority is to create curiosity. That is my number one priority in this whole presentation. And I'll introduce myself here in a second. I'll share with you who I am, what I do. I'll talk to you a little bit about my agency, my company that I've started. And we're going to go through some fundamental type thoughts in regards to Indigenous engagement and reconciliation stuff. But you'll notice that it's in a sequence that will make sense by the end of it, and hopefully that will uh, that will have some sort of influence on how you formulate your questions. So at the beginning of most presentations, we usually do a land acknowledgement, right? And so I'm not going to do that right now at the very beginning. I just put a note here in case you are wondering about land acknowledgement. It will come in due time, I promise. So the reason that I don't want to do it right at the very beginning is that oftentimes when I work with agencies within the province of Manitoba or nationwide, we've become complacent in the ways in which we do land acknowledgements. It just seems like it's a hoop that must be jumped through at the beginning of our meetings to make it look like, in many cases, make it look like we are part of the reconciliation conversation. But I want to address that a little bit more in time. So I'm not addressing or talking about the land acknowledgement right now, just because it will come, and I'm going to share with you the one that I personally developed and the one that I share. So to introduce myself, so my name is Shawn Charlebois. I'm currently situated living in a small community in Swan River, Manitoba. It's about 6 hours north of Winnipeg, 2 hours south of the Paw. But this isn't my home community. My home community is on the east coast of Canada. I'm from New Brunswick. My family on my father's side, the Charlebois side, arrived in Canada in the 1680s as soldiers and as fur traders. And they worked for agencies like the Hudson Bay Company, the Northwest Company, and the American Fur Trade Company. So my dad's side of the family were here from the 1680s to now, so several generations. It's my mother's side that's the Indigenous side. So my mother she's passed away now for 14 years. She is uh, originally Acadian. You've heard of the Acadians from the East Coast. And my family on my mother's side, they were referred to as the Filles de Roi, the daughters of the king. And our genealogy shows that the Acadian French on my mother's side arrived in Canada in the 1660s. 600 or 700 Acadian women were sent from France to Canada to be future wives of soldiers and fur traders. My family, the Lebrun side, was part of that. When the Acadians were expelled from the east coast of Canada, from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, many of them married into Indigenous communities, which is what happened in my case. So I am part of the Metapanagioag Mi'kmaq community of New Brunswick, Red Bank. And so that's where my grandfather was born. That's where my family are from. And so I have this unique privilege of being a blend between two cultures, an Indigenous side and a non-Indigenous side. So my academic training is I have an undergraduate degree from St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick in Indigenous Studies and Anthropology. I have an interdisciplinary master's degree from the University of Manitoba in Indigenous Studies, Anthropology, and History. And my area of focus is really on community-based planning from an Indigenous perspective. So I've had opportunity over my 30 some years now of working in reconciliation, of working with people who are Inuit, people who are Harvaktamut, Mute. I work with the Métis Nation here in Manitoba. I work with treaty people from Sapatoyak Cree Nation, Wisquacy Peak Cree Nation, Pine Creek First Nation. All of these communities are part of our wheelhouse when we engage and provide opportunity for educational development, employment. My grown-up job is I am the supervisor for Indigenous Human Resources for Prairie Mountain Health, one of the largest health authorities in Manitoba. And the area where I'm currently situated now has an Indigenous population of about 50 to 60%. So I'm always engaged with how do you include our community members in the development of social programs, academic programs, employment programs. And that's what I'm talking to you about today. So why is it important? Because no doubt over my years of doing this, like I said, I've had 33 years now into the field of reconciliation, which blows my brain because I'm 55 coming up. And I feel in my brain that I'm like 15, right? I'm really immature and I'm quite okay with that. So it's one of those things that I forget how many years I put in. Over those years, I've worked with numerous provincial and federal agencies in regards to reconciliation and education, training, culture, that kind of stuff, which is the reason why my Red Road Compass company is alive. There were some issues in our communities that were being missed. The 4 pillars that I identify as the most pressing within our communities in regards to reconciliation is affordable housing. So I purchased some buildings here in town, and we have apartments that we used to rent for low-income residents. That's the very first one. You have to have a place to live. The second one is food. You got to make sure your belly is full, because if your belly's not full, what's going to end up happening is you think about your hunger and not about the programs or supports that are in place to help you develop and grow. So we opened up a food soup kitchen here through Red Road Compass, and we were providing meals to up to 100 people a day. We live in a very small community of a population of around 4,500 people and then our surrounding catchment area. On top of that, we also do education. I was the director of education for many, many years on reserve as well as a band manager. And so the education part, I currently work right now with Yellow Quill University, which is the only Indigenous First Nation university in Manitoba. Prior to that, I was teaching for University College of the North, working with our communities directly, our treaty communities directly, and providing unique approaches to education. And then the fourth one for me is culture. Outside of town, we have 60 acres where we have a culture camp, and we do everything from harvesting medicines to ceremony to bringing people out from youth all the way up to elders to coordinate and to empower our community so that they can be role models, educators, teachers. So over my 3 decades of doing this, one of the things that I found was oftentimes people will say, primarily non-Indigenous people, and it's not because they're mean or angry or just ignorant or whatever. Oftentimes they ask the question, why is reconciliation important? So I just jotted down 4 parts here that I'd like to table before we move on here, because this is very important for us to get our mind around so that when we go through this presentation and asking questions, we have an appreciation of issues in our country that are still alive and well. So, number 1, why is it important to learn about Indigenous peoples and reconciliation? Because there was and still is significant wrong that has been placed upon the Indigenous peoples of Canada by Canada. This wrong must be acknowledged, addressed, and rectified. I'll give you one example. The Indian Act. This is specifically for individuals who are identified as status Indians under the Indian Act. Now, I respect that I'm using the word Indian, and you may say that's really inappropriate. You're right. The proper word is Indigenous, or we use the name of our nation. For me, I'm an Acadian Metapanagi Mi'kmaq man. But the word Indian is still present in the Indian Act. So this Indian Act, which was established at the birth of Canada, or just a few years after the birth of Canada, is still active within Ottawa. It's the government document that dictates how treaty status people live their lives on reserve. So these are things that we need to address. Number two, and you can see here that I have the word we capitalized. We are all related. We are community members, linked as parts of an extended family, attached by nationhood. We have a moral and ethical responsibility to care for one another. This is the way that Ruben and I met. I was retained by Heritage Canada and by Immigration Services Manitoba to provide supports to new Canadians when they came into our province. Oftentimes, we have this attitude of us, them. We got to get rid of that silliness. We are all Canadian people. In my case, we're Manitoba people. In my community of Swan River, we're all Swan River people. And we need to make sure that we strengthen those bonds so that we can address the issues in our community together. We cannot do reconciliation by ourselves. It's impossible. Number three, the Canadian Indigenous population is growing quickly. Based on the 2021 census, 1.8 million people self-identified as Indigenous. Between 2016 and 2021, we have to remember that our stats have been quite dated. Under Stephen Harper, when the long form census documents were suppressed, we lost some data time. So between 2016 and 2021, the Indigenous population grew by 9.4%. The only other population in Canada that's growing in comparison are new Canadians coming. This has changed because the Liberal government is now in flux, and there is a possibility that we may have a Conservative majority coming forward. Possibility. So this will change a little bit in regards to our new Canadians population shrinking a little bit. We're not sure exactly what that's going to look like. However, the Indigenous population is growing exponentially. So we need to take that into consideration that for your agencies, if you're looking for employees, or if you have individuals that you provide services to who run their own businesses, who need to find employees, they need to be mindful that there's a huge Indigenous population coming. The fourth one, investment in education. Forgive me here, that's grammatically incorrect what I put here. So federally directed for provinces. So there's money that has been sent to our provinces to develop curriculum which includes significant Indigenous content. Right now, Manitoba, my current home province, is the largest population base of Indigenous peoples. We have Métis, First Nations Treaty, and Inuit within our territory. So this is what I tell people. Your children, your cousins, your nieces, your nephews, who are already in school, are already being introduced to Indigenous content in their classroom. This is going to keep growing, right? More information is going to be shared with students as we go forward. So to increase your children's or your child's likelihood of success, however you define that, they will need to continue to learn about Indigenous culture, as well as develop and expand upon their personal relationships with Indigenous peoples. Right? This is part of the nation narrative. So what I tell people like you may say, I live in downtown Toronto and we really don't have any Indigenous people. Well, fair enough. But the reality is it's going to be in the curriculum for your classroom, for your children or your extended family or whatever. So do you not think that there is a bonus, a benefit for you to gain an understanding of what it means to be a non-Indigenous person in relation with Indigenous people, so that you can be part of the narrative and conversation with these younger people when they're growing, learning in their schools? So these are the four reasons that I use, and there's many, many more. These are the four that I boiled it down to. But these are the four that I share at the very, very, very beginning of my presentations because I want you to pay attention. I have a captive audience. My job is to try to give you information and, like I said, create some curiosity for you. So I'm going to be getting to my land acknowledgement right after this. Here's the challenge that I have today with you. You are spread across Canada. I don't know where your offices are, Ruben, but I'm assuming that they go from Toronto all the way to Vancouver and everything in between, right? If you look at this map of Indigenous peoples, and I recognize the word Aboriginal is on this map, it's a little bit dated, but for the sake of this conversation, you can see that from coast to coast to coast, there is a uniqueness of Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. So it's unfair and inappropriate for me to come to you and say, listen, I'm going to teach you a Mi'kmaq way of doing things. Because that may not be applicable to Vancouver because you're dealing with Haida Nation or the Tlingit Nation or Anishinaabe or Cree or whomever. So if I generalize about nation specifics in regards to culture, it may fall short for people who are not in that geographical area. This map shows you of the cultural diversity and difference between our Indigenous communities, our Indigenous peoples. Right? So you can just see it. It's a visual aid. I took this into consideration when I'm thinking of you. You are honoring me with your presence today. You are taking time out of your busy day to sit with me today. So I have a responsibility to service you the best way I can. The approach that I use today for this presentation and then question period after is I'm keeping the information and the approaches to gaining information for your offices very universal, for lack of a better word. You'll be able to take some of the information and the recommendations that I've provided you and run with them so that they are applicable to the First Nations, Métis communities, Inuit communities, or Inuvialuit people in your communities in your own way. So, why is this important then when we talk about land acknowledgements? I'll give an example. When I was doing work down here for our Southern Immigration Office, one of the things that was evident when I read it on their wall was that they copied and pasted it from somewhere else because they were making reference to a group, an Indigenous group that didn't have any presence in their geographical territory. So what does that tell me? That tells me as an educator that I have a responsibility to identify that land acknowledgements are incredibly important for Indigenous reconciliation. Why? This is the first time in Canadian history that Indigenous peoples have the ability and right to define themselves on their own terms. Think about that. The first time in Canadian history that Indigenous peoples have the right and ability to define themselves. For me, land, water, air is a key component of who I am. Therefore, if you wish to acknowledge me, Mi'kmaq people, Cree people, Anishinaabe people, Inuit people, Dene people, Dakota people, you must recognize that a part of their identity is attached to the land on which they stand. So, instead of just having a generic printed out land acknowledgement that you put on the wall and say, look, we're doing reconciliation, why not take the time and speak from your heart and write it so that it shows that some time was taken to reflect upon the people who are in your territory? This is what I wrote. This was specifically designed for my work with new Canadians in southern Manitoba. You can use this if you wish, but I would encourage you to use it as a guide and have you and your team sit and reflect about meaningful language that could be placed on your land acknowledgement. Here we sit, and I write oftentimes like I speak. Here we sit, one facing the other, on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota people. This land where we have come together to talk and to share, to learn from one another, is also recognized as the original homeland of the Métis Nation. I acknowledge and respect the treaties that were produced, reviewed, discussed, and signed by the ancestors and representatives of Canada in this territory. I acknowledge that these treaties are still active and relevant to the Indigenous peoples mentioned above, the peoples who still reside in this territory and call it home, as well as to all peoples who are currently visiting and or live in this beautiful part of Canada. We at Red Road Compass dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation, collaboration, education, and healing. I am honored and thankful for being here. So you will note in here that I did not make reference to the specific treaty number. Our area here is Treaty Number 4, signed in 1874 at Capel Valley, just here in Saskatchewan. I'm cautious about using treaty numbers as the point of reference of this collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. This treaty in our area was signed in 1874, as I've said. History existed for millennia before that. So in order for me to avoid perpetuating a colonial attitude of using a treaty as the point of measurement of worth or identity, what I do is I just recognize in the second paragraph that treaties exist, but at the very beginning, I start with the acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples were here. Because oftentimes you'll say, we acknowledge through treaty number 4 that, fair enough, but if you're really precise in your language and interpretation, that reveals to your audience that you're using a colonial document as a document for acknowledgement of existence. Right? And we existed long before that. So like the map of our Indigenous nations, your service offices are spaced out across Canada, oftentimes drawing on from unique services and peoples that are offered nowhere else. Therefore, I'm being mindful of the way in which I am sharing strategies and information with you so that you do not perpetuate generalizations and broad sweeping recommendations regarding engagement and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This is, and I'm not trying to sound like a stinker here when I say this, and my words don't have thorns when I say this, but broad sweeping generalizations worry me. Oftentimes when people are in presentation mode and they talk in broad terms, to me, it's a reveal many times that they haven't done their due diligence to figure out actual grassroots movement programs that affect people in your neighborhood that can be measured, however you define it, or however you wish to design it in regards to measurements. Broad sweeping approaches to reconciliation. So things like, we have to address this colonial process. Well, what does that mean? That could be anything and anything, right? This colonial project is just, suppressing our organization and not allowing Indigenous peoples to grow. Well, which Indigenous peoples? What's the problem? In what area? Right? These broad sweeping generalizations are often used to mislead your audience to think that you understand the issues. But to me and to others, it's a tell that there's not much of an understanding. And I'm not saying this in a mean way. What I'm saying is make sure that you choose the language and you put a little bit of point on that language. Because broad sweeping approaches to reconciliation creates, and I just chose 3 here, frustration in our Indigenous communities, right? Because our communities are saying, if you haven't done the research, then you're not ready to get into the game. So for example, I used to play a lot of basketball. I'm much older now and my knees can't take it, right? So in the old days, when I was doing a jump shot, you can't just throw me into a game and go, all right, Shawn, now go shoot a jump shot. You got to practice, you got to practice, you got to practice. So you shouldn't be getting into the game until you've done your due diligence and done a little bit of research, reflection, program development. That shows the community that you're serious about reconciliation. Because there's an entire history of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships where it's evident that it was really one-sided, that it wasn't reconciliation. It was one person or one organization trying to manipulate the situation to take advantage of. And this apprehension and cautiousness from our communities is still there until they get to know you. So, first one, frustration in our Indigenous communities as a result of broad sweeping approaches. Second one, usually creates more questions than solutions in service agencies. All right, so somebody at the table says, we got to work on reconciliation. Well, what does that mean? Right? Third one, action paralysis. This is the one that oftentimes you'll find is where you're like, okay, we got to do some work. Let's define what reconciliation is or the colonial process. It's much too vast because you haven't narrowed your focus yet. You get busy, reconciliation goes to the side, and you focus on other things that usually have more detail. And then reconciliation gets pushed to the side until a later date. So, in order to, and this is my gift to you, so in order to ascertain, to figure out what your office is capable of doing, what your staff members are capable of doing, there are a couple of little approaches, exercises that I've invented over the years that help break down that that apprehension about learning about reconciliation in Indigenous peoples. So here's what I've learned over the years. If you ever go into a room of non-Indigenous peoples and say, does anybody have any questions about Indigenous peoples? Very, very rarely will anybody raise their hand. If they do, they're usually kind of soft questions that really don't get at the root of what it means to fix things. And there's a reason for it. Oftentimes, non-Indigenous peoples are just curious and they've never had opportunity because of our current education system in Canada that never really paid respect to Indigenous culture from an Indigenous or through an Indigenous lens. What happens is you have non-Indigenous people who have never had opportunity to really learn what an Indigenous person or community is. It's not their fault. It's just the way the system's set up, and that's what we're trying to change here. So if you ask a group about, does anybody have any questions? The questions are usually soft, and the reason they're soft is that the participant does not want to come across as ignorant or culturally intolerant. They're concerned. They don't want people to look at them, make fun of them. Or if they're in an organization where they have supervisors above them, what happens is they're concerned that it may hinder their progression in the company. Right? I'm not going to get an advancement because apparently I don't know what I'm talking about. So there's a concern, an apprehension. For me, when I do reconciliation work, my hope is to not have any Indigenous peoples in the audience. I don't want to preach to the converted. I want to work with people who don't know, where they can be comfortable, where they can say, you know what, I trust this Shawn guy. Ruben, when you said at the beginning when we were in Vancouver and you got to see me present and you're like, man, I feel comfortable with this person. That's what my job is, to make sure that people are comfortable so that they can be honest and ask the questions that they really want the answers to, so they can be better Canadians, better people, better service providers. Right? So here are two things. I'm going to give you two exercises. This is one that I invented when I was working down for the southern part. This is yours. I'm gifting this all to you. It's free, yours. Play with it all you want. Change it, adjust it, throw it away, use it, don't use it. It's yours to use. Rank the images on the page, the next page, from 1 to 6. Number 1 being the impression that comes first to your mind when thinking about Indigenous peoples. Number 6 being the last impression that comes to your mind when thinking about Indigenous peoples. I designed this exercise because when new Canadians come into our country, most often time, they are perpetuating a romantic image of what it means to be an Indigenous person. Teepees, igloos, drumming, dancing, feathers. Because the tools that they use to educate themselves, for the most time, or most part, is Hollywood movies. That's how they define it. That's when you're hungry and the only food you have is inappropriate material, that's what you got to eat. So What we found over the years, or what I found over the years, is that when I did this exercise with new Canadians, the first thing they looked at was teepees. You can see it in the bottom. Right above it, you can see a graveyard. Didn't know Indigenous people still existed. Or to the left, on my left, you can see that individual sitting on the bench, a marginalized person, destitute. Those tend to be the three images that non-Indigenous peoples have when they first come to our communities. They don't think about, in our corner here, you may not be familiar, but that's Wab Kinew in the bottom left. He's the very first Indigenous premier in Canada for Manitoba. You can see a Métis sash, part of our culture. In French, they refer to that as a ceinture fléchée, an arrow belt, or up top, a nuclear family, not taking into consideration two-spirited LGBTQ or any of that, but for the sake of this conversation, a biological family, male, female child. What we found in the past is that when new Canadians come in, primarily people of color, so new Canadians that come from Africa or the Caribbean or wherever, because we have cultural intolerance towards skin color, I don't use the word racism because that's a misnomer. There's one human race, cultural intolerance, right? So let's get specific here. So with people of color, especially living in areas that are predominantly white, what will happen is those people will soon readjust their cultural bias, their lens, where they see teepees, romantic images, nobody on the land, destitute. And what happens is it changes to a cultural intolerance that is currently in place in Canada towards Indigenous peoples. This feeling of uncomfortableness, this feeling of not trusting. If I'm walking down the street and an Indigenous man's walking towards me, I got to cross the street because there's an increased likelihood that I'm going to be jumped or whatever. So the reason that that's done is we have cultural intolerance in our communities towards Indigenous peoples. It was deliberate by the Canadian government. That's a different conversation. But for people who are of color, they don't want to be the attention of cultural intolerance, right? Because they're visually different. So what do? They change their mind and they start to unite with non-Indigenous white people in Canada, and they begin to direct their attention towards Indigenous peoples as, oh, those guys. It's a safety mechanism, right? You're deflecting the attention away from you and you're directing it towards somebody else. So very, very interesting. So this exercise, if you were to do this with your group, it will reveal where they're thinking. And you can do this in complete anonymity, right? That's where the second one comes into. This one was I invented a while ago. And I've done this for thousands of people. This is the one, Ruben, that I introduced to our group when we were in Vancouver. Give a cue card, no information on the card, white. Everybody has the exact same pencil, no names, no identifying marks, no nothing on it. Say to your audience, to your staff members, to whomever, this is applicable to any group. And say, listen, this is an opportunity for you to ask any question or make any comment in complete anonymity. It gives people the freedom to ask what they want to ask without feeling like they are going to be judged. So when you write the question down, big brown envelope, have them raise their hand, you go over with the envelope, you turn your back, you let them slip the card in. What we would do is we would bring them back and we'd dump them on the table. And then my team and I would sit and we'd begin to answer them as honestly as we possibly could. If we didn't know what the answer is, we'd direct you to an agency that could answer the question for you. This is very, very important to establish a baseline of the abilities of your staff member to engage with community. So just to go back here, a couple of slides, I know you're probably thinking, no, keep going forward, but it's making sure that you have some understanding and appreciation of what you're getting yourself into and what you're asking for. Make sense? Okay. So those two exercises is yours. You're recording this. If you ever have any questions going forward about how to do it, don't hesitate to call me. So Say you've done this exercise now with your office, and you say, all right, everybody, we are at a level now where we wish to engage with our organizations within our community who are Indigenous. So this is interesting. When I did that cue card question with Ruben's group when we were in BC at the P2P, and also when I did it for our Southern Immigration Services offices in 4 different communities, what was evident was new Canadians wish to engage with our Indigenous communities, but they just don't know how. They just don't know how. There's a nervousness, an apprehension, an uncertainty. Fair enough. So if you as an agency are interested in engaging with, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Because it would be important for you to choose a topic, a focus that is applicable to what you wish to do, and something the First Nations have already deemed as important. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action. If you wish to read this, you can jump online and you can type in TRC 94 calls to action. These 94 calls to action have been developed and pulled together in consultation with Indigenous groups all across the nation. It's broken into 5 main headers. I'm just going to move my room or my little pictures here. It's into 5 main headers, and then it goes into subcategories: child welfare, education, language and culture, health, and justice. These 94 calls to action are divided into these 5 headers. Within these headers, there are subcategories. I won't read them for the sake of your sanity. I won't read them for you. But go look. You may find something in here that is applicable to your office, something that is important to you. The one that we were working on with new Canadians was recommendation 93 and 94. Very bottom, newcomers to Canada. That's what we worked within. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. This information is already available to you if you want to go find it. So say now you go into these TRC recommendations and you say, we want to work on education for reconciliation or youth programs, whatever you decide. Choose that one. Well, where do you begin then after that? Do not reinvent the wheel. So when I work with my students, many of the exercise that I give to them are things like environmental scans, organizational scans, community scans, internet scans. So environmental scan number 1, determinants of health. I'm not sure if people are aware of the determinants of health. This surprises me a little bit. So Canada has their own determinants of health. The World Health Organization has their own determinants of health. And they break it into 12 categories. It would be things like the community you're born into, income, education, clean water, those types of things. The one that is missing from the determinants of health, in my opinion, is number 13, access to the internet. It's not in the determinants of health for the ones that I've read, but I have seen it in another determinants of health document. Access to the internet. So why is that important? In our community right now, we have a large drug problem. There's a large population of people who are marginalized, homeless, couch surfing, living on the street, dealing with methamphetamine addiction, dealing with morphine addiction. We made the national news just recently that we have a substantial increase in HIV in our community as a result of drug paraphernalia or needle sharing. Largest, we have like 40 people in our small community that were just diagnosed with HIV. And so those determinants of health will show your organization, your people, areas that you can focus on. At the very beginning of this presentation, I talked about a 4-pronged or 4-legged approach to Red Road Compass. Affordable housing, filling your belly with food, education and training, culture preservation, or reintroduction to culture. To me, those four are strong enough for you to make a table to kind of lean on a little bit so you can develop your skills. So just as an aside, determinants of health. This is something that I've known about for 20 some years. I just did a professional development workshop last year at the regional school division here. I had about 80 participants, teachers, trying to figure out, like you, how do we engage with our communities? And when I did the cue card exercise, their primary question was, how do we get our children involved in learning? And I asked the questions, how many people here in the audience are aware of the determinants of health? I had one person raise their hand, and I had one other person not sure, raising their hand just a little bit. Out of 80 people, these are teachers, good teachers. Many of them I know because I live in a small community. Blew my brain that you're asking one question of how do we get people to engage, but you're unfamiliar with what the World Health Organization deems as necessary to address to give communities, children, organizations like you some direction when providing direct service. So that's the first thing I would recommend, an environmental scan. Number two, organizational scan. Just because you're coming up with a new idea does not necessarily mean it's a new idea. Do a little bit of research, pick up your phone, call around, send an email. Look for Indigenous organizations or services in your area. Now, what people could be saying in this presentation is, well, that's why we're calling you. How do we do that? We're nervous. We don't know how. We don't know if we're going to be well received. We don't know if they're going to be rude. They're going to hang up. Mark my words. If you make an effort to reach out to these organizations and say, hello, I am Shawn Charlebois. My office is really engaging with reconciliation, and we have a vision of working with our communities in a certain capacity. We're familiar with the recommendations of the TRC. We're aware of the recommendations of the determinants of health. We do not wish to reinvent the wheel. We would love to have conversation with you so that you can share with us what you're doing and to see whether or not we can complement it. Or if you have too heavy of a workload, is there anything that we could carry to assist you with? It would be terrible for you to do all this lifting, all this research, all this work, only to go to a community and say, hey, this is what we want to do, and have them turn around and say, thank you very much, but we've been doing that now for 4 years. What happens in that case? That paralysis kicks in. Well, we tried. And that's where we stop. So I'm going to say this to you, and you can even say this to the people on the phone that you call. Reconciliation is not just for Indigenous people to do. It's not just for non-Indigenous people to do. It's for all of us to do it together. Reconciliation. You can't have one without the other. You have to have all the parties at the table. So with that, keep in mind, I would strongly recommend that when you reach out to these organizations to have assistance, to have conversation, don't do it when your project has already been decided in 3/4 of the way through. And then coming to you and say, hey, we'd like to consult. These organizations will look at that and say, well, you didn't really want to consult. What you're doing is you've already made your plan, and now you're coming to us afterwards because you want some feel-good points to say that you've included us. Include these groups at the nose end of the initiative and be consistent. Invite, 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 welcome. Get them involved. If you approach them with an open heart, with a plan, showing that you've done some due diligence and did a little bit of research, you will be welcomed with open arms. So that's 2. Third one, community scan. Not sure whether or not you have First Nations treaty communities in your area. If you do, reach out. Reach out to the band office, talk to a band manager who is the administrative CEO of the community, and ask him if you can go for a tour. Ask him if they can come into your agency and give a talk. Share with your organization, your staff members, what's currently happening in community. What are they trying to do? Is there anything we can help you with? You're going to find that there's going to be a lot of similarities to what's happening in community and what's happening in your community. What are the similarities? Affordable housing, full bellies, access to meaningful education, and some way of preserving our spirit, however you do that. If you're Muslim, you wish to be with your Muslim family. If you're Christian, you like to be with Christian. If you're Jewish, you like to be with Jewish. If you're Buddhist, you like to be with Buddhist. And what we're doing is we're propping up our spirit and being stronger so that in times of need or hardship, we have something that we can lean on so that we can gain our strength back. So that's the third one. Reach out to our communities. Don't be shy. Fourth one, internet scans. Programs that have a similar form or mandate to what you want to do. I would recommend that if you want to look at cutting edge social programs that are currently happening, Australia and New Zealand. For some strange reason, they've been leading the way in regards to things like cultural safety, cultural sensitivity training, social programming, dealing with their Indigenous populations, trying to rectify and identify cultural wrongs. So just because it's not in your province and it's not in Canada does not mean that it doesn't have value. Right? But there's a little bit of work that needs to be done here. This is my last slide, then I'm going to shut up and then we can have a conversation, but I just wanted to throw this out here. Not sure if you've ever heard of the 7 sacred teachings. So the 7 sacred teachings are Anishinaabe teachings. So the Anishinaabe, the people, used to be referred to as the Ojibwe people. So the Anishinaabe nation, the Mi'kmaq nation, my family's nation, historically were connected to the Anishinaabe nation, and then they separated for whatever reason. But the 7 sacred teachings, and I really see these, and when I promote them, these are not Indigenous. They were made by Indigenous peoples, but these are the 7 sacred human teachings. This is what makes our nation stronger and better, makes me as a person stronger and better. Respect should not be expected but earned. Once given, it's returned. When you go into a community or reach out or work with a coworker, don't assume that just because you have a master's or a PhD or a whole bunch of experience that you have value. My mother had a grade 5, my dad had a grade 10. I'm the only person in my family that has ever graduated from high school, went on to university, kept on going. We were really, really poor. I was taught that there are people who are book smart and world dumb. Some people who are world dumb and book smart. The question is, when you're dealing with the people across from you, do they bring value to the conversation? This will go down to the 6th teaching, that humility teaching, right? But we'll get there. So the first one is respect. Don't go into these conversations thinking that the communities are desperate or dire. There are very qualified, capable, knowledgeable experts in these communities that can help you. Courage, mental or moral strength to virtue, persevere, and withstand any difficulty, danger, fear, or hardship. Some people find it very difficult to do a cold call, but it doesn't take very long after you make up or pick up the telephone and you treat that person with respect on the other end. All of a sudden, it becomes a joy. Look at Ruben and me. I had no idea who Ruben is. Every time we see each other now, we talk about basketball, and I love speaking to him now. If I was cowardly and I don't want to talk to you, then I would have missed this wonderful opportunity working with you. This is born out of courage on both of our parts. 3, honesty. Keep your life simple and speak the truth. Choose honesty and kindness as your guide. Now, if your intention with working with our communities is to make things better for everybody, that's fantastic. If you're reaching out to a community because you feel that it may give you an advantage when looking for a promotion, which has happened in my world, don't do it. You're going to do more harm than good. Love, unselfish concern for the good of another. This doesn't surprise me in your world because you are all in the service providing business. How do you make people's lives more comfortable? Wisdom, ability to discern inner qualities. My dad has always taught me. My dad is a true elder. He's 84 years old. He moved here after my mom passed away so he can be close to us and we can help him. My dad has always taught me this. Wisdom is not free. It will cost you blood, sweat, tears, or money, but you're going to pay for wisdom. You're never going to get it for free. Our communities have tons of people who are incredibly wise. Now, I'm not trying to generalize and say everybody is. Some people are better than others, just like in our communities. But they have the wisdom of the history of our Indigenous communities, the challenges that they faced, the obstacles they faced. So, the next one, humility, the quality of doing something out of the goodness of your heart and not for yourself. When you go into these communities by phone, in person, come in with a good intention in your heart and recognize that you are coming to each other equal as human beings. You have a set of skills, knowledge, understanding, capabilities. They have a set of skills, understanding, knowledge, capabilities. You are equals. You're not coming in to save them. They're not relying on you to save them. What they're looking at is partnerships. Last one, truth, sincerity in action, character, and utterance. Speak the truth. So at the very beginning, like I said at the beginning with respect, if you're working with a community and you wish to engage with them, don't do all the work, come up with the plan, and then invite them in. Be honest. This is what our intention is. We would love for you to participate with us. This is what our mandate is. This is what our intention is. This is the way we're going to try to do it. This is what our hopeful outcome will be. And ask, do you see this? Like, does this make sense? Yes, it does make sense. Would you have any recommendations? Have you tried something in the past that worked that we can maybe emulate, copy? Have you done something in the past that didn't work that we don't want to duplicate? That truth, being open, honest, and transparent, is key to success with working with our community because history is riddled with examples of one person saying one thing and then doing another. If you wish to establish trust in our communities, you must live by these 7 sacred teachings, must perform your duties in your job based on these 7 sacred teachings. If you do that, you'll be set up for success. So, very simple presentation, but I wanted to speak that way because I wanted just to lay the foundation that you can build your programs on. If I were to come in here and say, you need to talk to Addiction Foundation Manitoba, well, I don't know if that's applicable to your community. So I would show my naivete if I were to speak that way, right? The foundation that I just shared with you, which is very, very simple, is quite complicated when applied properly, thoroughly. So I'm going to stop talking. That is my hour, almost to the minute. Not bad, eh, Ruben? I've done a few of these. And if we can maybe open up the floor for questions, conversations, and I say this honestly based on the 7 sacred teachings, there is nothing you can ask me that can offend me. Nothing. So say what you want. You're not going to hurt my feelings. Ask your questions, and I hope that I can provide some at least guidance where you can get an answer, or we end it here.
Thank you, Shawn, for that. And I appreciate how you navigated so much and spoke to such a broad thing without, anyways, I'll let people get to the questions. Here's how we're going to do this. Put your question in the chat so that we can have a speaking order, even if you just want to put a number so that I know who's going next. And yeah, first question. I'll open
Don't
it
be
up to,
shy.
yeah.
And if I may, Ruben, I know I'm interrupting. So here's the thing. We only had an hour to talk about stuff that takes a lifetime. I'm 30 years, like I said, 33 years into working at reconciliation, and I still haven't figured it out. People are different, times are different, right? If at any time you have a question and you're at home making chili and you're like, oh, I should have asked them, don't be shy. Send me an email or send Ruben an email. I'll respond to it and then I'll send it back to you. I would prefer that you send it through Ruben because then it can be shared with other people if it's appropriate. Right? But questions come at all times of the day and night.
Great. First question, who wants it? Are there no questions? Okay, before we get to the questions, and does anyone have any feedback or compliments or anything to give to reflect back to Shawn? No, it's Shawn, I'm now a firm believer in a practice where when someone does something good, you should let them know, just because yeah, so that they do it more for other people going forward. Do you know what I mean? So
I
yeah,
gotcha. I gotcha.
and I don't have any. Okay, we got a question. Okay, so Keith, do you want to speak? Go ahead, Keith. Take it away. If you don't, I'll read it out for you. But go ahead.
He's a great present. Oh, please. Sorry.
Only to say, great presentation. Thank you so much. This was wonderful, and I felt bad that I stepped in late, and now I have to leave early to see my boss. But I'm actually then sort of glad there's no questions, so that because otherwise I'd love to be still engaged in the conversation, and I feel like if things come up, I'll happily reach out to Ruben. So thank you, Shawn.
So Keith, before you go, thank you very much for coming and participating. I'd like to direct the group so you can learn a little bit more going forward. There is a web page that we did with Heritage Canada and with Regional Connections or Immigration Office. It is TRC, Truth Reconciliation, TRC93.ca. TRC93.ca. If you're bored and you have a couple of minutes, go browse through it. There's all kinds of interesting information that we put in there, and just for you to explore. There's everything in there from history to contemporary issues, all kinds of stuff. So thank you, Keith.
Thank you for that. Bye.
Yeah. Tell your boss I said hi.
And thank you, Keith. Okay, so the first question is Elaine. What's up? Elaine, go ahead.
Sorry. Hi, folks. Hi. Sorry, I'm working remotely today in a funny chair in office, so I apologize for the delay in my response. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you, Shawn. Thank you. I unfortunately was unable to attend those Southern Manitoba sessions that you hosted recently.
Are you in Manitoba?
I am. I'm do the local immigration partnership in the Pembina Valley. And so, I have a million questions, but I'll try to narrow it down. I actually recently just heard this today, and I feel really, or recently, that there was a reference in our region to often recognize the OG Cree as part of our Indigenous heritage. However, I just heard that has recently been changed to their original language or reference. Have you had any knowledge of that?
I do. So where I am right now, we have two communities about 60 kilometers north, 80 kilometers north of where I am. Wesquacy Peak, which is Birch River, and Sapatoyak. Both of those communities are OG Cree, which means, everyone, that the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe people, and the Cree people, for whatever reason, amalgamated and married together. What the history shows is that during the introduction of fur traders to the central part of Canada, many of our communities were decimated by disease, smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, all of these things. And so there were these voids in our community as a result of communities dying off. The hunters, the women, the children, the elders, the knowledge keepers. It's a very dark part of our history. So what happened is you had many Anishinaabe people from Ontario, from the Interlake area, or not the Interlake area, but the Ontario Trail area, the border, moving into these vacant spaces that were historically lived in by the Cree, the Dakota, the Nakota, the Lakota people. And so they married. And so you have this blending of language. It really depends on, and this kind of scratches me a little bit wrong. Oftentimes we get so caught up in semantics and use that as a distraction to really getting to the true root issues. My recommendation to you would be, whomever you're dealing with in a session, if there is OG Cree, be polite enough and say, how would you like for me to refer to you? So, and I'll give you an example. I'm working right now. We've started a new initiative in Manitoba through Red Road Compass, where we are going to be a hosting agency for international professionals to come and work in our communities as educators. That's the new thing that we've built here. When I work with somebody and I say, this person's name was Celadonio, would you like to be referred to as Cel, or would you like to be referred to as Celadonio? Ask the question and let them decide. To me, that is a small advancement towards reconciliation and being polite. It's the same thing when I was working up in Baker Lake. I was working with people and they were saying, I said, would you like to be referred to as the Inuit, which are the people? Or in your case, your traditional names. We'd like to be referred to as the Harvokdarmute. Easy. So instead of saying an Inuit elder, I would say a Harvokdarmute elder, Jimmy Tepana, or an Ikiksalingmute elder. But there's an effort that must be done by us as facilitators to learn how to pronounce. And as long as you're honest, those 7 sacred teachings, as long as you're honest in your approach, then people laugh. And that's part of our culture too. At least you tried. That would be my answer. It depends on the person.
Okay, thank you very much.
Did that help?
Yes. It was a home run.
Well,
Okay.
you're saying that because you're just polite.
No, I'm saying that because I felt it in my body. I typed, when in doubt, ask before you said it. We're all with you. It's beautiful. Elaine, your question was amazing. All right, I got to go to question 2 because I got 6 questions and I want more. Mauricio, talk to me.
Yes, thank you, Shawn, for your presentation. I guess most of everyone who's in this room knows that sometimes our organizations struggle with budgets, and I think that in the spirit of wanting to fairly compensate or express gratitude to Indigenous individuals for their time, work, or knowledge, whether it's by consulting that you mentioned or collaborating or sharing their expertise, how can our organizations with small budgets navigate these conversations in a way that's respectful but also meaningful? Sometimes I debate, like, should I tell them what my budget is, or should I ask what their fee is? I am a big person that always says you need to put your money where your actions are at, but sometimes there's not enough money. So I was just wondering if you can maybe guide us a little bit on that.
Excellent question. So one of the things that Red Road Compass does, my company, and I started it off oftentimes, and I'm coming back to your question, but you know what? We have a tendency of story talking here. So oftentimes people have asked me whether or not I wanted to be a not-for-profit organization. And so I said, no, I don't want to be, because my entire career has been working either with chiefs and councils or with boards. And I'm done trying to convince people to do the right thing. So oftentimes, because I'm a for-profit organization, I will work with not-for-profit, and there are tons of grants out there and funding specifically for working with Indigenous groups, Indigenous peoples, or some sort of focus on reconciliation. I'll give you an example. The United Church of Canada. There is a substantial amount of money that's been earmarked and set aside through the United Church of Canada as a way of compensating for the harms done through the residential school genocide. Okay, so if you do your due diligence and do your research, there's money out there, number one. The second thing is, depending on the people you work with, if they're more of a traditionalist, money may not even be part of the conversation. It could be tobacco or a gift. I'll give you an example. This last weekend, I have people here who approach me for medicines. So I work a lot with medicine. We harvest medicines and stuff. And so this weekend, I was dealing with bear grease, which is a very powerful medicine. Balsam poplar, white cedar, and some yarrow. All of these things we harvest, and it takes us time. Today, I gave a jar to a friend of mine who deals with eczema. This will help her with her eczema. She provided me tobacco. That was more than enough. In our culture, and it's funny because you look at me and you're like, that guy's really white. But you got to remember, on the East Coast in New Brunswick, we had contact for 250 years before they even came to the prairies. So it depends on the group you're dealing with. And I would strongly recommend that when at the very beginning of your conversation for that preliminary, at least have a meal, some juice, some fruit, maybe some muffins or something like that, where you can come together, have a welcoming. And then right at the very beginning, be honest and truthful and say, listen, we have a limited budget, but we really wish to work with you. You may find that community might come to you and say, don't you worry about it. We have money set aside and we're going to work in partnership. And you may find that you're the one not being compensated for doing the work with the First Nation. Broach it right at the very beginning. There are some elders and knowledge keepers that you will have to approach and say, we would like your services. Do you walk a traditional path or a non-traditional? If they say traditional, make sure you have some tobacco for them, because that's how we do business. And ask them right up front. I recognize that money's tight. We really want to work with you. Can we maybe have conversation about what you're expecting from us? And we will share with you what we can afford. When I worked with Ruben, and we had this conversation at the beginning, because I'm being compensated for this and I'm really thankful. This money goes right back into my programs anyways. Right at the very beginning, what I shared with Ruben was, I don't wish to overcharge you because I want a long lasting relationship, but I don't want you to take advantage of me. Please share with me what you have, and I'll share with you what I'm kind of expecting. If you're paying me too much, I'll be honest with you and say, I think that's too much. And we adjust it accordingly. And to me, that is a very honest approach at reconciliation.
That's great.
It's awkward though, because we've been taught never to talk about money.
Exactly.
Right? It's ugly, but that's that bravery teaching. You just got to step forward and say, cards on the table.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Shawn.
In a capitalist society, it's always based on advantage. I want the most for the least. Set that aside and talk about reciprocity, general reciprocity. If you do that, if nothing else, that people across will kind of say, oh, at least they're trying. Did that help?
That's helpful. Thank you very much, Shawn.
If somebody comes and asks you for $1 billion, move on. That means they're, because here's the thing, do not assume that all Indigenous peoples are good people. And I had an elder teach me this years ago. Regardless of your cultural identity, you have some people who are really, really good and some people who are no damn good. Listen to your gut. There are many people out there who are trying to make a profit and using this to their advantage. Listen to your gut.
Thank you, Shawn. That was very helpful. Thanks.
Next, we have Mitch. Mitch, you still with me? You ready?
Yeah, hi, sorry. Shawn sort of answered my question. Hi, Shawn. Thanks for the wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
You did sort of answer my question in the last answer. It was along the lines of a nonprofit, and sort of I am of two minds of that sort of thing. You know, I understand that profit is the air that we breathe in a capitalist society. But don't you think that, you know, to really get into sort of a real systemic wide change for Canada, that it has to sort of be an anti-capitalist sort of arrangement at the end of the day, or that wealth distribution is something that needs to be looked at, and having the desire for profit be the number one concern seems to be part of the problem.
Yes, 100%.
But then on the other hand, I know it's a common issue in sort of leftist politics or circles that this purity test, essentially, that, well, I'm not going to, if somebody's not 100% on board with, my way of doing, that there's these little, and that we we shouldn't really expect. So I guess my question is, do you see the future of reconciliation work generating money for people? Like, is that a long-term, like, is that a good business? Like, should other people do that for profit, do you think?
Great question. Great question. And I guess I would be the qualified one to ask that, because my Red Road Compass is for profit. Right? Because I'm working, like I said, I've been working for this health authority now for 15 years, and I'm kind of done with it. Right? So Red Road Compass, my company, was born out of me doing an environmental scan in our area and identifying shortcomings. And my job was to fill those. That's what I wanted to do. I saw opportunity there and I took advantage of it. If you were thinking about leaning towards a socialist type approach to our society, you know what? On paper, that sounds great, but how do you apply it? Right? And that's the challenge is, and this is what I was kind of mentioning at the very beginning, is the reality is in the 21st century, This is a capitalistic society. People do stuff for money. Right now in Canada, we have a national conversation about Jordan's Principles dollars, where there was an abuse of this federal funding in many communities by many people who were Indigenous. And now the federal government is doing this revamping of how you apply for Jordan Principle dollars to provide a complement to the current social programs that are taking place with children. So this is I know I'm kind of babbling here, forgive me, I'm going to bring it back into focus. So in regards to reconciliation, yes, there are ways for individuals to generate revenue. The question is who wants to make the money? This is what I'm getting at. Here in Swan River, we've introduced something through Red Road Compass called non-timber initiative. Canada has an entire industry based on harvesting trees, right? That's part of our national identity. But there are ways of identifying through an environmental scan medicinal plants that are on the land that can be harvested in a sustainable way, not debating whether or not we should be harvesting medicines for sale. That's a whole different conversation. And we buy these products from our community members, primarily people who are Indigenous, and we pay them top international value. So the plant that we harvest now is something called high bush cranberry. And this plant historically was harvested in Manitoba, and Indigenous peoples who were harvesting it were being paid $13 a dried pound for this bark. We want the bark. $13, and it's a lot of work, $13 a dried pound. The moment that Red Road Compass took over, we negotiated with our international buyers. We sell it to 5 companies, large industries in the southern United States, and they push it on to China. We are now negotiating and paying our community members $31.47 a dried pound. So when we think about reconciliation, one, we've identified that this traditional plant that was used as traditional medicine in our community now has value on an international level. 2, we have convinced people in our communities that that traditional knowledge from your ancestors has value. And 3, we have assigned that your labor is worth money. Where historically we had a society that would look at them and say, work for free or welfare. So it's one of those things where it depends on who you're talking to, which community, and what the product is. And I know it's a roundabout answer, and I hope I'm answering your question, but reconciliation is so complicated. At the end of the day, people still need to buy food. And they need to be able to do it in a way that is meaningful for them instead of sitting in a chair for 15 years staring at a screen. So the reason that Red Road Compass is introducing this non-timber initiative is that we have a large number of people in our community who we identify as marginalized. They're homeless or they couch surf. Oftentimes they deal with addiction, some more serious than others. They've never completed middle school or high school, and the likelihood of them going to university or college is very unlikely. Many of them have cognitive challenges or what have you. And what we're trying to do is to provide them opportunity to tap into their identity, their traditional knowledge, to generate enough money to be comfortable. All right, so it's a great question, and I don't think I answered it, and I'm sorry that I didn't, but it's quite complicated. I think I made it more I think I made it more confusing than anything.
I think,
and I'm sorry for that.
No, I think it helps me sort of understand, like part of our work, is sort of taking a look at systems and, redesigning things. And, so it sounds like you're saying, we don't need to necessarily go right to the drawing board in terms of like the beginning of the end here was the commodification of resources and labor.
Absolutely.
And all of that. And, we can use what we have now and just try to make a better world without necessarily the revolutionary, we need to tear it down, start fresh sort of mindset. Yeah. Okay.
Because if you have that mindset, it'll never happen because there's going to be such opposition and resistance that you're going to be paralyzed.
I'm going to jump in real quick. Mitch, I think about this all the time. Maybe we could talk about this. But I think money is also energy, time, appreciation. It's a lot of things in how we flow in the universe. And if we stop to talk about money because we want to change the whole system, then the energy is not going to flow and people need to eat. And if we weren't making money right now, we wouldn't be in this moment. So money's not just money, but got to keep it moving. Ariane, you want to go? Yeah.
Okay. Hi. This is Ariane from Halifax Immigration Partnership in Nova Scotia.
Oh, you're from home.
Yeah. I asked a quick question, but I'm not sure if you can answer me. And it's probably a complicated answer, but I am curious to know. I am far from understanding all the call to action. Do you see them being met, or have you seen them being met, or something?
So there is a quick Google search that you can do. Please forgive me, I can't remember the search, and I'm going to come back to your questions. I'm not deflecting here. There is a web page. It's a .org web page. If you go to Google and type in which TRC recommendations have been addressed, there will be an immediate pop-up that will assess the ones that have been approached. Some have been closed, some have been just opened, some haven't been touched at all. So when you look at the overall main categories, occasionally some of the subcategories have been addressed, but most of them haven't been. And I'll give you a perfect example. So recommendation 93 and 94 out of 94 recommendations is tailored and directed to new Canadians. The project that we just finished here, Red Road Compass, in partnership with Heritage Canada and Regional Connections, it took us 3 years to secure funding through the feds for that. And we were the only partnership that was addressing new Canadians to the extent that we were in all of Manitoba. Now, as I mentioned before, we have one of the largest populations of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And based on the numbers that I heard through Steve Reynolds, the Executive Director of Regional Connections, there was approximately 15,000 new Canadians that came to Manitoba. And nobody other than Regional Connections and Red Road Compass was doing the education support services that we were doing at that level. So yes, to some, kinda for some, but there is still so much work that needs to be done. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't want to do the work. I think it comes back to the paralysis point that I made. And I see this at the school division. So I help do curriculum development here. And the teachers say, we want to do it. We want to engage with our students. We want them to be successful, but we don't know how to do it because it's so new. And this is what I think Ruben was referencing when I was speaking to one of the other employees is in our communities, we talk about 7 generations. It's going to take an incredibly long time for us to change our mindsets, to change our approaches. The population is growing of Indigenous peoples. The non-Indigenous population is shrinking. New Canadians coming in. People are getting more educated. Wab Kinew, the new Premier of Manitoba, first Indigenous Premier in Canada. We have to be a little bit more gentle with ourselves as advocates for change and recognize there's only 24 hours in a day, 7 days a week. I have a partner. She and I have been together this March 16th. This is going to be our 30th anniversary, our 30 years together. I have 2 children. I want to be a dad. I'm a son to my dad. We have stuff that needs to be done. So we must be patient with ourselves and a little bit more gentle so that we can do the work that we can do in our own little world and hope that our neighbors pick up the staff and do the work as well. But I'd recommend that you maybe do a Google search. It'll be a .org. It's a university. Actually, I'm going to be rude here. It's like me looking on my phone while you're on here. I'm just going to check on my other computer.
Last call for questions. We got 10 minutes left. So if you got
Okay.
questions, get them in. No,
Well,
I'm just saying
like
that
I
while you're
said,
doing
Ruben,
that.
at the very beginning, it's
Yeah, no, we could do more.
If people want to throw
Put
more,
it in the
so
chat, Ruben.
how many TRC recommendations
And Mike,
have been implemented?
It's yellowheaded. I think it is yellowheaded.
It is. Thank you. So it's calls to
yeah.
action accountability, yellowheadinstitute.org.
Some are happening slowly. Like there is motion happening, but you know, that's a great question. Your question's very open-hearted. I'm gonna keep it moving just for time.
Yes, Ruben, thank you.
Janet, you're up next. All right. Okay, Janet is not up next. Next, we have a name I've never seen before. I'm gonna do my best. Elish from CGRIP.
Oh yeah, that's me.
Yeah, sorry,
Eilish.
Hi,
coach.
Leash.
Yeah, so just I guess saying what I said in the chat, I want to thank you guys for this opportunity. And I did love how you mentioned, Shawn, that reconciliation isn't just for Indigenous people and isn't just for non-Indigenous people, but for everyone to work together towards that.
Yes.
What advice would you give, like, when working towards reconciliation as a community? Like, there's always the same few people showing up to the table. How do we encourage others,
Oof.
both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to engage?
That is the $1,000,000 question. You've heard the saying, if you want something done, ask a busy person. Doers do, right? What a great question. I don't have an answer for you. If you were to ask me 20 years ago, I'd probably have another recommendation. You know what the real curse is? This kind of silliness. Right? So now we're not just competing with the initiatives that are happening in our community where all of a sudden you're trying to convince somebody to play basketball and not volleyball. Now you have these global interferences of people spending hours upon hours flipping through stupid. Right? Because these things have been designed to interfere with our brain patterns. And so I don't know what the answer to that. Each community would be different. What I have found over the years, and I hope none of the stuff that I'm sharing with you comes across as me bragging. It's not my intention, so please forgive me if it does come across. One, be patient with yourself and be patient with your organization. The more work that you do based on those 7 sacred teachings, you will find that you will have a bigger buy-in going forward. Here's an example. I've been hired by the Dauphin Friendship Center, which is 2 hours south of us, to do four session within 1 day, 4 days. How confusing is that? 4 days of workshops. Initially, they would get 5, 6 people to these sessions if they ever did them in the past. Because of the important work that we do with Red Road Compass with all of our partners, they're in excess now of 45 participants, with one of our First Nations bringing in busloads. So I think what it comes down to is through engagement, through self-reflection, through organizational reflection, those community assessments, right, that I talked about. If you begin to have pointed focus on your service, engaging with those agencies you wish to work with in partnership, you will find that people will come to you. The people will come to you. The reason that, and please don't take this anybody, I'm not saying this with thorns on my words at all, is oftentimes people will not engage with organizations because they don't feel that it represents them properly. Okay, I'm not saying anybody online, like maybe if you did a presentation, you worked really, really hard. I'm not trying to be a meanie to say that. But when you boil it right down, that tends to be it. We tend to focus our attention on things that necessarily we think are important, but the communities don't think are important. And what we need to do is we need to sit together and have dialogue. And then you'll start to see your engagement grow. But even with our communities, like I provide support and teach for Sapatoya Cree Nation here in partnership with Yellow Quill. And with our young kids, that's their priority. This is the curse of the 21st century. And our ancestors will look back and say, what were they thinking? Introducing this to children, right? Be patient with yourself, engage with others, organize your approach to a specific target. Don't try to solve all the problems, just try to solve a little bit. And eventually it'll start to compound. And you'll get busier and busier and more people engaging.
Out of respect for time, I am not going to let Ruben ask the last question only because...
Ruben, ask the question.
No,
you have
okay.
all the time in with me.
All right, go ahead, Ruben. Talk to him. I can't say no to Ruben, I guess.
Thank you so much. I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I just want to say thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of learning for us. I am Ruben, and I'm from Immigration Partnership Winnipeg here. We've been, try our best to work with newcomers, educating them about Indigenous realities and, a little
Yes.
bit story through some of the material that we have called the Indigenous Orientation Toolkits. And so we've been doing that. And I think what I'm just, trying to emphasize from what you said earlier about that collective effort, from of us to be able to achieve reconciliations and especially here in Winnipeg for us, one of the big challenges that downtown is home to newcomers and it's home to Indigenous people, and sometimes there are time of tensions, and regardless of all the little work that we do, people newcomers are coming, and and also Indigenous people also coming to downtown, and the resources very limited and things like that. So I just want to say thank you to the work that you are doing, and maybe if time allowed, we'll have a time to chat with you again and see how we could learn from each other more.
Absolutely. One of the things that I'd like to just bring based on Ruben's comments is there's two things that you need to be really mindful about when you're talking about, how do I come into the sentence? Two things that I've experienced. Many non-Indigenous people oftentimes will experience something called, let me see, just escape me here for a second. It is misdirected guilt. Just because you're a non-Indigenous person, you feel this incredible weight on your shoulders of, I have a responsibility and I have to be, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Set that aside. Just set that aside. That's not helpful. If you did something wrong, own it. Those 7 sacred teachings again. Make sure it's right. But from the Indigenous community, oftentimes you'll get something called misdirected anger. They've been abused by the system for so long, and then all of a sudden you see a new community or a new person that comes into the community who is from somewhere else. And oftentimes in their brain, they're saying, well, why are they allowing new people in when they haven't even addressed my issues yet as an Indigenous person? And I've been here, my family's been here for millennia. So there's misdirected anger and misdirected guilt. And so the misdirected anger oftentimes is thrown at people because it just happens that I'm frustrated. I don't have a voice to really attack, to approach, to discuss, to address the person who can make real change. And you happen to look like the person that I'm angry at. Blah, you're going to get it. It's a coping strategy for somebody who's been injured, right? Is what it is. So if you have somebody walking down the street who's Indigenous and they're screaming at you and making you feel small, breathe. Don't let it stick to you. Let it flush away and go on with your work to being the best person you can, working towards reconciliation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was incredible. When I said there were no more questions, I was going to try to do a thank you, but Ruben did an amazing job, and the way you cleaned that up and landed the plane was so clean. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much. It's 2:30, and I just wanted to take back what I heard from you a little bit. You said be specific. You said like do your research. You said approach it with humility and truth. You said approach it with honesty and approach and move locally and think about supporting people in tangible ways and just handling it like that. I think that was really, really clean, and I really appreciate the way you managed to give wisdom on such a broad national issue without being specific but also being real. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. And
take care of your stuff in your own backyard and hope your neighbors do the same.
Absolutely.
Right. And that's your own little backyard, your own little spirit, your backyard here, but also your organization and your community. And you hope to goodness that your neighbors do the same. And that's how we have that ripple effect nationwide.
Okay, Shawn, do you have time for one more question?
I have time for an.
Let's go. All right. So
I have a captive audience. This is what it's all about.
Diana, you're up.
Actually, Fiona was next.
Fiona's not here. I've been looking for the.
She is right here.
Did she come back?
Here.
Fiona,
yes.
come back. Sorry, Fiona. I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. I think I'll just read it out from the chat. I honestly think sort of the previous question, maybe you got at some similar themes. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. obviously right now we're seeing reconciliation be increasingly valued, especially in our community where I think it was maybe a bit slower to pick it up. Like honestly, you could say it's popular right now.
Where are
Kind
you,
of for
Fiona?
background. So I'm in southwestern Ontario. We're in St. Thomas Elgin, which is like just south
Ye-
of London on the North Shore of Lake Erie.
Yep. So
Yeah.
you're in Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee territory.
Yes. Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and then also Adirondack as well, neutral people. So I just know that that means that there are a lot more organizations reaching out to Indigenous groups for education and collaboration in our region, especially like in what would be colonial boundaries of our local immigration partnership. Like those organizations are very few, they're very small. Sometimes it's just individuals. So I always wonder about how to balance wanting to work with Indigenous peoples, with organizations, but not expecting the same few people or the same small organizations to take on like another request, another meeting, another email, and just like wanting to balance genuine intentions, I guess, with working and also wanting to be cognizant that you don't want to just turn around and be like, and another thing, and another thing. And like, yeah, just kind of that balance is something on my mind all the time.
Well, one of the things you could do, and we do that here, is you don't have to have meetings weekly. You can have them quarterly or even every 6 months. So as long as you have the preliminary point of contact to discuss reconciliation and say, we respect that you're very busy, but we wish to move this forward. And we feel the proper approach is to have you involved with the preliminary conversation and allow the community to decide where they invest their energy and time. They may turn around and say, oh my goodness, Fiona, what you're doing is exactly what we've wanted to be doing forever. And they've been distracting themselves with other stuff that hasn't been really appropriate, necessary, but they're doing it because. So allow the community to decide who they wish to play with. And if they're really busy, it's easy to flip it around and say, would you mind maybe sending a representative? Because I was the director of education for Curve Lake First Nation just outside of Peterborough. Okay. And on that committee, on my education board, because I was the director of ed, I ran all their education, we had youth representatives, male, female, and both of them had voting power. So it might be as simple as creating a terms of reference with the First Nation that maybe brings in a youth. And then it's the youth's responsibility to go back to the community. And you can have conversation with the education department and say, hey, can you award credit for this person to participate? There's all kinds of creative ways to have that community involved. They'll let you know if they're too busy or not. Right. But like I say to my kids all the time, I'm not going to say no. If it's not going to work, you say no. Right? Because it's that self-doubt in our brain. Right? Let them say no. And by just asking, we'll have value in regards to reconciliation. But I hear what you're saying, right? Because doers do. And if you want something done, ask a busy person. Because they're good with time management.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's very helpful. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Fiona. Sorry again. I'm blind sometimes. Diana, do you have a question? Are there any more? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Ruben. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you, Shawn, so much for the wisdom, for the sharing, and for the inspiration. I'm located on the West Coast and in British Columbia, specifically in Surrey, which is actually on the traditional lands of many smaller First Nations. And so that kind of brings me to my question, which dovetails a little bit with what Fiona said. I've taken a lot of this, of your amazing advice to heart, and I've made a relationship with one of the local First Nations. And I just wanted to share with you that your approach is like, it's so beautiful, it's so spot on, it's so heart-led. And once you start to build these relationships, it really is, it's a beautiful thing. And as you were saying before, you know, you learn so much, and every time you get a chance to speak to an elder, it's such a gift. One thing I have noticed as I become more familiar with the First Nations, I get drawn into a little bit more of the politics, how they feel about each other, how they feel about the Métis, how they feel about the urban Indigenous population. And I'll just say that in my city, we're at 2.2% Indigenous population. So it's not like perhaps in other regions where they're very visible, they're not. And the First Nations are really small and concentrated on very tiny urban reserve. So, there's a lot, the families are all interrelated, intermarried, and
Yes.
they're beautiful families. But of course, there's some tensions here and there. And I always feel like sometimes I'm walking a little bit of a tightrope. So I just wanted to know, it's a beautiful gift to be able to get to know all these people as well. But is there anything you would like to kind of comment or suggest in terms of just kind of trying to keep out of that part of it?
Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a tongue-in-cheek type comment. It's better to stay out than to get out. So politics is part of it. And the reason politics is part of it is because we're talking with sums of money, right? And that's what it comes down to. Historically, many of our communities, and this is what I was making comment of at the beginning of this presentation, is this is the first time in Canadian history that Indigenous peoples are able to define themselves on their own terms. Because payments from FNIB, First Nation Inuit Health Branch, payments from Indian and Northern Affairs or Indigenous Northern Affairs, however they wish to call themselves, that money has been very, very, very compressed and limited over the years. And we can see this coming up in news reports all over. So you have this attitude in many of our communities, especially between the Métis and Treaty people, or non-status people now and the Métis and Treaty people. They're fighting over crumbs. They have been conditioned for generations to fight over crumbs. And it's caused this colonial attitude towards each other. Now, that's not to say that historically there wasn't tension and there was fighting and people being killed and all that other kind of stuff, but not to the extent that has now presented itself in regards to slander, gossip, all this other kind of stuff. So politics is politics. It's all about money in many cases. And so my advice to you is, unless that has a direct impact on the work that you wish to do, stay out of it. Especially when you're looking at longevity. So when I was the director of education for Wiskwasi Pikir, I had the privilege of working through 5 chiefs and councils. I never took political sides. As an outsider from this community, that gave me an advantage because they knew that if they confided in me, that they wouldn't see me at the local pub or the bar blabbing about family members or anything, because I didn't know who was who. My job when working with these groups was to make sure that the information that I was collecting from government agencies or from community was represented to them in a non-biased way. Here's the information. Make your choice. And I would sit back. And as the band manager at the time, what they would do is they'd say, what's your recommendation? And what I would say would be, if you take this path, this is the potential positive, this is the potential negative. If you take this path, this is the potential positive, this is the potential negative. Keep your mouth shut, sit back, let them decide. You let them decide. So if you can remove yourself from any of the financial, other than if you're running a program in reserve, you still are responsible for your budget and your accountability on how your money's spent. But outside of that, I didn't want to participate because it gets too mucky. And the challenge with that is, if here we have mandates where chiefs and councils are in power for 2 years, unless there's a banned council resolution, you can extend it before. So you might, if you get involved, have a really good relationship with this chief and council, and then they lose. And the new chief and council that you upset is now in power. Well, now you have to reestablish all of those relationships. And you lose the momentum. It's easier to stay out than to get out.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you.
Here's the information. If they say, what's the recommendation? I don't give recommendations, I give facts. Here's the positive, here's the negative. You decide.
Super, thank you. Thank you, Ruben, as well, and Shawn, for creating this safe space to ask what for me is a very difficult question to ask. So thank you for that. Yes.
You know what the problem is with that? Is oftentimes, and I have a hard time shutting up too, because I just jibber jabber all the time. But it's one of those things where we just must respect the quiet and sit in silence. Even if they're thinking about it, it's not our place to comment. You just need to kind of bite your lip and sit back and let them steer the boat. They're your bosses because they are the leaders of our sovereign nations, these sovereign nations. Yeah, I don't know if that helped.
Yeah. Oh, it did. It really, and you're
Yeah.
right. I'm exactly what you said. I button my lips and I'm like, but you know, it's because I do respect these beautiful people so much because they've opened so much to me. So, you know, it's just as you say, they're just being put through this colonial structure, and it's just it's you know, it's sad to see it, but it is what it is, and they'll work it. They'll work it out.
Resilience. Think of all the pressures that have been placed on our communities for hundreds of years. Right, the Mi'kmaq people on the East Coast and the Maliseet and the Passamaquoddy people, those like the Wabanaki Confederacy people, 350 years, 400 years, right? And so we just need to have faith that they're going to do the best job that they can. And if they're going to make a mistake, it's their mistake to make. If they're going to have success, then it's their success to celebrate.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? People, this is a good time for questions. If not, then this is a good time for no questions too. but are there any more questions? No? Okay. Well, are there any more? Is there any more space for any thank yous? Does anybody want to say thank you with?
Oh, we don't need to fish for that. But
I'm not fishing
Ruben,
for it. I'm just trying to.
If
you know what I'm talking about.
If there's any more questions from your staff, from your acquaintances, please do not hesitate. Anyone, if you have any emails or questions, you can send them to Ruben, and then Ruben can forward them on to me. I'll respond and I'll send them back to you, and you can distribute them because they might come later.
Okay, so there's one person that wants to give a thank you. My heart wants to thank you, Shawn. Thank you. We trusted you, and we're glad to ride with you. My heart thanks you, and yeah. So that's the last thank you, I guess.
I'm so happy, Ruben, that our paths cross, and I hope we're not strangers going forward.
I told you we're gonna be friends when I saw you. I mentioned, I was like, can we be friends? I didn't say let's collaborate. I said I want to be your friend. I wasn't playing. And I don't think the East will win. The East is not winning the NBA championship this year. I don't believe in the East. I don't believe in the Celtics. I'm sorry. I don't believe in them. They're jump shoot. I don't believe in them.
They're doing well, though.
I don't believe in them. Okay. Thank you very much, Canada. I'll see you soon. I appreciate you. You'll see this video on our YouTube and all that other stuff. But I appreciate you all for the work and the questions. Thank you so much. Every drop fills the ocean, and we are cousins. Appreciate you all.
That's right.
Yeah.
My pleasure to all of you. Be well, be strong. Take a breath. Celebrate your accomplishments. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Thank you so much, Shawn and Ruben. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.